Today, I want to talk a little about wholeness and brokenness and how they're intertwined. One cannot exist except in relation to the other. Probably heard of the line of Leonard Cohen's, there's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. Well, just a week ago in Texas, it was from a crack in the window that the water rushed into the cabin of a 9-year-old camper at Camp Mystic named Bertie Miller. Bertie woke up around 2:30 in the morning to the storm and needed to use the bathroom, which saved her life, because then and only then did she become more aware of the water that was entering through that crack in the window. Outside, the water was already shoulder high, so the only way counselors could get Bertie and her bunkmates to safety was through the window. And she was evacuated by staff members to safety by piggyback. Now, there's nothing from that tragedy that could be deemed good, but from this devastation emerges stories of courage. From the cracked windows, the water poured through, but so did the light. And this week's Torah portion says, yes, there can be light emerging from the devastation, from the crack, for that is precisely how the light gets in. So Pinchas, the name of the portion and the key figure, who was he? He was a terrorist, you could almost say. And how does a terrorist, an extremist, suddenly merit one of the greatest gifts a person could receive, a brit shalom, a pact of peace from God? So let's back up a step to last week's portion. The story begins when the Israelites encamped at Shittim and were assailed by a whole bunch of Moabite women who lured them into worshiping the god of Baal Peor. It's always the women, you notice that are blamed in these things. Incensed, the God of Israel ordered Moses to, quote, take all the ringleaders and have them publicly impaled before the Lord, so that the Lord's wrath may turn away from Israel. But flouting Moses' orders, an Israelite man took a Midianite woman, we can assume for sexual relations, and Pinchas, the grandson of Aaron, stepped into the chamber with his spear and skewered the couple, thereby averting God's wrath. And we then hear, in retrospect, that a plague had been raging through the camp, that the death toll was 24,000. So this incident is horrific, and it really competes with the golden calf as the low point in the Israelites' sojourn in the desert. Moses fails to control the mob or punish anybody, and Pinchas steps into the breach, operating under no court sanction, no command from Moses, just no orders from God directly. In fact, he just took it upon himself to run a spear through this couple. It doesn't get any bloodier than that. But here's the worst part. That was all sort of last week's portion. Now, in this week's portion, the worst part of it is that for his efforts, God rewards Pinchas. Not only does he get away with it, he gets the biblical equivalent of the Nobel Peace Prize for it. Surely there is no one in the history of the world less deserving of this peace prize, this Brit Shalom, than Aaron's grandson, this double murderer, Pinchas. And not only does he get this Brit Shalom, this covenant of peace, but he gets the entire portion named after him. And it's an important portion because it's one that's read from many times during the course of the year, because it includes sacrifices listed at the end. So this killer gets a covenant of peace. But if you look at it closely, there's something very odd about this covenant. So I hope you can see it now. You see the Hebrew word in the middle. It's the word shalom, but where the arrow is pointing, That is the letter Vav, but it looks very unusual because it is sliced through. It is cut in the middle. It is an incomplete Vav. And so what are we going to do about that Vav? So, welcome back. This broken Vav, sort of where it gets interesting. Only two Hebrew letters are composed of two separate broken parts, and Vav is not one of them. They are, for those who might be familiar with Hebrew, Kof and He. So if any other letter is printed, of course, the Torah is handwritten. Every letter is handwritten. And if any other letter is broken, that renders the entire scroll unkosher. It becomes an unkosher Torah, with one exception in the entire Torah. This Vav, in this word, which isn't just any old word, it's the word shalom. It's the O of shalom. It's called a Vav Ketiyah, a split Vav, which is not like a split infinitive or a split P. And by the way, why do they call it split pea soup anyway? Shouldn't they call it smushed pea soup? I don't want to get into that. But anyway, here's the kicker. The word shalom, which means peace and friendship, and hello and goodbye, also means whole and complete. So the word that means whole is itself broken. The two are connected. Wholeness and brokenness are one. There's nothing so whole as a broken heart, said the Kotzker Rebbe. They're inextricably connected. You can't understand one if you haven't experienced the other. Bertie Miller experienced the brokenness and the wholeness, the near-death experience of that flood and the new lease on life from the same crack in the window in Texas. And Pinchas experienced it too. The commentary in Eitz Chaim states that peace is not truly achieved except by peaceful means. Otherwise, it is a broken peace. And Pinchas's peace was a peace forged through violence. It was not a complete peace. The Talmud says the split Vav allows us to interpret shalom with a Vav or without it. Unblemished and whole is not about Pinchas himself, but if we make the Vav whole and call it unblemished, then it's a sign that the priesthood will be given to Pinchas's unblemished offspring. So it's his children who are entitled to that peace prize. It's his children who are not disqualified from the priesthood, like Pinchas, sort of like King David, who was a man of war. His peace was forged through violence, so he was not allowed to build the temple. And his son, whose name was Shlomo, Solomon, but the word shalom in his name means peace. So if we look back, and I'm not going to share it right now, but it's the beginning of the portion. Verse 11, Pinchas's name in Hebrew has an unusual yud. It's not just about the vav, it's the yud of Pinchas in this portion. And again, you can go back to where I shared before and see it. It's a tiny yud. They used to make fun of his little yud. They called him Pinkala. Maybe they didn't. But the letters yud and vav have a lot in common. They are whole in and of themselves. They contain no empty space, and they are whole like shalom when they're unbroken. The yud symbolizes wholeness, but a diminished one compared to the vav. But it became whole as Pinchas's progeny became unblemished through teshuvah. And again, we go back to those first few verses that I shared before. Verse 13, it says, Pinchas atones for Israel. He did teshuvah, in essence, for himself. So he's not qualified to lead the people. In fact, in this very same portion, Joshua is pointedly chosen for this job. He's too zealous, but he does teshuvah. So his legacy becomes eternal. Think, Menachem Begin, who was a zealot in his prime, but who then shook hands with Anwar Sadat. The potential for change is always there. And even today, we have a lesson. The more brutal the war, the less likely it is to forge peace on the morning after. Right now, there is no day after plan in Gaza. And if the broken Vav is to be understood, it'll take a generation or more. Maybe the next generation, like Pinchas's next generation, maybe that next generation will have a chance. But the longer and bloodier this war remains, the longer it will take. So here's one more interesting part about Pinchas's legacy. In the Torah, he never dies. The Bible never records his death, which is pretty unusual for a leader of his caliber. So there are traditions that he was to remain himself a priest forever. Long after Joshua dies, in the book of Judges, verse 28 of chapter 20, Pinchas is mentioned. And at the end of the period of the judges, it says, the people of Israel inquired of the Lord, and Pinchas, son of Eleazar, son of Aaron, ministered before the ark in those days. The very same. Lived a long time. Numbers Rabbah, the Midrash says, behold, I am giving him a covenant of peace, that he is still alive. There are only a few biblical figures who don't die, and they have connections to this portion. One is Pinchas. Two are the sons of Korach, who was also quite a number, a pretty bad guy, a rebel, but his sons wrote Psalms. His progeny lived on to do amazing things. And then there was Elijah. In a normal year, when the portion doesn't fall during these 3 weeks of mourning, the Haftorah, the prophetic portion, is about Elijah. So Elijah and Pinchas were seen as sort of similar. And like Pinchas, Elijah's birth is never recorded, just as Pinchas's death is never recorded. And did you ever see them together in the same place? There is some belief back in ancient times that they were the same person. Both are called zealous for the Lord. Both perform special sacrifices. And here's the key. Both were really mean, vicious people. But in the end, they had an image makeover. Both did teshuvah. Both evolved. And we see Pinchas's teshuvah here. And Elijah, well, he became the embodiment of kindness, of charity and hope. Sort of the Jewish Santa Claus going from house to house, drinking a sip of wine instead of a glass of milk, though. When and how was the image of Elijah changed so completely? Maybe he, like Pinchas, was able to piece together the broken Vav. The Midrash sees Pinchas as a peacemaker between the tribes. He was, in the end, a peace-loving guy. The rabbis wrote in Ethics of the Fathers, be like the sons of Aaron. Seek peace and pursue it. Who were the sons of Aaron? Well, Pinchas was one of those descendants of Aaron. There's a sign prominently displayed at Camp Mystic in the dining hall. I'm not sure it's still there, but I have a feeling it will be. It's near the bell that calls everyone together. And it's the message, be kind to one another. That's a message for us right now. Steve Bannon spoke cynically a few years ago about MAGA's goal to, quote, flood the zone with chaos and disruption. Our response must be to flood the zone, even in a flood zone, with kindness and love. And that's what they did at Camp Mystic. They flooded the zone with kindness, like the two 19-year-old counselors from Mexico, of all places, who knew that the tragedy was unfolding in all the other cabins early that fateful morning, but they were responsible for the girls in their own bunk, who were upset and worried. And so the two teens hid their own fears and focused on distracting and entertaining the younger girls from the moment they awakened until they were evacuated by military vehicles around dinner time. Had to wait a long time. We had to put on brave faces so the girls wouldn't know, Silvana Garza told a Mexican news outlet. Garza and fellow counselor Maria Paula Zarate have been recognized for their heroism by the Mexican government. Their story has also gone viral on social media. This is a Brit Shalom. This is flooding the zone with kindness. And that's how we repair the broken Vav, by letting the love stream in, because that's how the light gets in. Prominently displayed in that dining hall is that sign, "Be kind to one another." And they put it to practice last week. When the response to overwhelming tragedy is overwhelming kindness, it takes the breath away. It sucks the oxygen out of evil. It may not soften the blow that much, but it helps restore belief in the human potential for kindness and ultimately the potential of goodness to win out. The Torah's response to Pinchas for an act of unspeakable harshness was a pact of peace with a broken letter, an imperfect peace. But for now, that needs to be good enough. So let's flood the zone with peace, even if it needs to be an imperfect, broken peace. Or as Leonard Cohen would call it, a broken hallelujah. Because that's how the light streams in. Thank you.